So welcome to all those joining us today, both in person here at CDRS and online via Zoom. My name is Tia Sager, and I am the Senior Research Associate here at the Collaborative Digital Research Space, or CDRS for short, at the University of Toronto Mississauga. CDRS is a research facility dedicated to supporting collaborative and innovative research in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. We aim to foster conversations about cutting-edge, collaborative, and digital research, both at UofT and more broadly. Today's Research Spotlight event, Discourses of Sustainability and Futurity Across the Environmental Humanities, highlights the interdisciplinary and collaborative work of the Toronto Penn Oxford International Research Cluster on the Environmental Humanities, and brings together 7 scholars to discuss the exciting and emergent discipline of environmental humanities. Before we delve into the panel discussion, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So please be aware that this session is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you're welcome to keep your camera off. We invite you to participate in the chat, and we have enabled the Q&A function for this Zoom meeting, and there will be time for a Q&A period at the end of our panel of speakers. So I'm just going to make sure that everything is functioning okay. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right. So it is my pleasure today to introduce our moderator, Professor Imre Szeman. Professor Szeman is the inaugural director of the Institute for Environment, Conservation, and Sustainability at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and a full professor of human geography. He has worked extensively on topics of sustainability and conservation, and in 2020, he was named as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. I will now turn the floor to Professor Szeman, who will introduce our panelists and tell you a bit more about the International Cluster for Environmental Humanities.
Thanks very much, everybody who is joining us via Zoom. I just want to first tell you that I'm going to disappear from the stage here to let these people have a bit more space. I'm not disappearing entirely when I go away. I'm just going to introduce our panelists, and I have a little bit maybe to say after everybody presents their papers, makes their presentations. So let me just start with our first presenter, Joseph Gerbasi. He's a Shirk postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, researching the influence of Greek oratory on Plato's dialogues, showing how Plato's political thought is rooted in the concerns of the public speech of his day, concerns about civic identity, collective memory, and democratic sovereignty, for example. His research has taken inspiration from longstanding debates in social and political theory and history, and he's beginning a project that brings together ancient philosophy and the environmental humanities, which maybe is what we're going to hear about a little bit today. Please. Oh, sorry. Andrew disappears for a bit.
Thanks. So yes, I'm here today.
Make sure to speak up, I'm supposed to say. And if not, you can use this if you want.
Was I
well, I don't know.
A bad start?
No. I'm just supposed to tell you.
Okay, so someone will tell me if I'm too quiet.
Can you hear him?
Can we hear me?
Okay, great.
Good. Okay, so so I'm speaking on behalf of ancient Greece, ancient Greek culture, literature, and philosophy. So as we imagine humanity's future, what might come about, what we might make of it, what we might make it, why should we think about humanity's past? And why should we think about the ancient Greek past in particular? One answer is that we already do. Yes, many of us already use the cultural legacy of ancient Greece to imagine the future and indeed to make sense of the present. The purpose of my current research is to help us continue to do so, only more lucidly, deliberately, and perhaps productively. So to illustrate, I'd like to begin with the tragedy of the commons, a phrase coined by Garrett Hardin in 1968 in an essay of the same name. This essay has been influential and has also received much criticism. Hardin begins from the premise that human beings, if left to their own devices, will pursue their private self-interest, and that this is a perfectly good thing. But there is a big problem with this. Namely, if everyone freely pursues their private self-interest, they will end up depleting all the resources that humanity holds in common. And this would undermine the possibility of anyone continuing to pursue their self-interest. So Hardin's theory amounts to more than a basic warning against the overexploitation of resources. And this is clear when we think about the fact that he invokes the concept of tragedy. Tragedy, of course, was invented in ancient Athens in the 5th century BC. Tragedy was the name of a kind of theater, but it was also a worldview, a distinct way of looking at the world. In today's vernacular, the term tragedy tends to mean just a really bad thing that happens, a tragic car crash, for example. But the ancient meaning, which is the one that Hardin has in mind, involves more than this. Primarily, it involves a sense of necessity. The bad thing follows by necessity from the good thing. The depletion of the commons follows necessarily from a pursuit of self-interest or from individual freedom. That's one dimension of the meaning of tragedy. Another significant one is that tragedy involves dramatic irony. That is to say, the person who suffers the tragedy doesn't see it coming. Because of our natural limitations, tragedy tells us, we're blind to the complexity of the world in which we act. So when we try to do something good, we also unexpectedly end up doing something bad. In Hardin's view, we don't realize, or we don't allow ourselves to realize until it's too late, that by pursuing our self-interest, we are also destroying our shared resources. So to be sure, there's something compelling about characterizing our present environmental crisis as a tragedy. For one thing, it's psychologically, aesthetically consoling. But is it not also dangerously misleading? For it implies that human nature is such that human beings cannot do otherwise than selfishly pursue their interests without thinking about the future and without, say, participating in collective decision-making about the common good. And I don't think we can take this assumption for granted, and neither does Greek tragedy, in fact. So let's remember that Greek tragedy emerged in a very particular social context. 5th century Athens, the time of tragedy, was also the time of democracy, of collective governance. This was no accident. Think about the protagonists of your favorite Greek tragedy. Oedipus, Medea. They all have something in common. They're all kings and queens, monarchs. Tragedy applies to a society governed by monarchs, by individuals. Likewise, Hardin's tragedy of the commons is governed by the principle of individualism, not to mention the so-called 1% who disproportionately, who wield disproportionate political power in their private interest. The lesson that the Greeks took from tragedy, however, was that a better world was possible. In Athens, the institutions for collective decision-making were designed, and let's not forget they were fought for, to be more sensitive to the complexities of social reality and to better serve the common good than previous kinds of social organizations had been able to. And this logic, I could talk about parallels of this logic in contemporary ecological thought, such as in criticisms of the recent term, the Anthropocene, which is arguably tragic in its valence. But for the sake of time, I will jump to my next and final point. One might wonder whether democracy does not also tend towards tragic self-destruction. And this question, or this wonder, brings us to the 4th century philosopher Plato, the perhaps the greatest or original critic of democracy. Plato is best known for his book, The Republic, which continues to be widely read as a political treatise, one that harshly criticizes Athenian democracy and recommends, instead of democracy, that humanity be ruled by an elite class of philosophers, the philosopher kings. And indeed, one prominent voice in American environmentalism, William Ophuls, recently published a book called Plato's Revenge, in which he argues that there is no democratic solution to the environmental crisis. And what is needed is a kind of ecologically enlightened and authoritarian vanguard. Now, whether or not we accept Plato's political solutions, there can be no doubt of the continuing relevance of the problems that he identifies and describes, chief among which, and that which underlies his hostility to democracy, is the problem of education, which is the Latin or the Greek word paideia. Simply put, how should people who are going to be politically engaged, how should such people be prepared intellectually, psychologically, morally, emotionally, even libidinally, which is something that Plato talks about. And moreover, how might a suitable educational program be implemented, given that in Plato's time, similarly as in ours, the prominent form of education or civic education was somewhat laissez-faire and promoted spectatorship more than engagement, consumption more than, let's say, well-being, the pursuit of well-being and self-improvement. And this is what is expressed in Plato's famous parable of the cave, which for good reason in this year 2023 is an internet meme. Okay, so to conclude, I've identified 3 topics or problematiques: tragedy, democracy, education. These have been passed down to us from ancient Greece and have endured in our thinking and have taken on a new significance, I think, in our age of climate crisis. So that's where I'll leave off. Thanks.
I'm back. Thank you very much, Joseph. Thank you for keeping your comments brief. That's not always the case. So the second person that's presenting today is Venus Bivar. She's an associate professor of environmental history at St. Anne's College at the University of Oxford. Her research and teaching are located at the intersection of environmental, economic, and European history. And her scholarship excavates the histories of major contemporary global phenomena, from the international agricultural trade system and climate change to the primacy of economics in political life and the centrality of free markets to the liberal democratic state. All right, you ready to go?
Great, thank you. So that was lovely, Joseph, thank you. My presentation is going to be much more schematic and just sort of an empirical rundown of what I'm working on these days. Maybe I can think more about what it might mean in the Q&A at the end. So my current project is about industrial pollution in Marseille from the years 1950 or so to the middle of the 1980s. And it's titled Unsafe Harbor, A Political Ecology of Post-War Marseille. And at its core, this project is located at the intersection of like industrial pollution, economic growth, immigration, and urban planning. I had originally wanted to write a political ecology of immigration, strictly immigration, and just couldn't find the source material. So I had to blow the project up a little bit. And to get things rolling with the project, I'm starting with a court case that took place at what was probably the most famous building in Marseille. in the 1950s still is Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. I'm sure many of you have seen slides of this building if you haven't visited it yourself. And the residents of the building, which opened in 1953, sued a factory more or less across the street because so many residents were experiencing acute asthmatic episodes in response to ricin dust that was wafting over from the factory. And the slide that I have up now is a photo taken from a window at Le Corbusier's building of the factory, just to give you a sense of how close it was. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the judges sided with the plaintiffs, which is fairly extraordinary, given that most of the time complaints about industrial pollution were ignored. So one of the things that I'm thinking about is why this particular case was successful when so many were failures. And then from here, I'm going to explore a bunch of different themes that come out of the court case. And the first one will be to think about how local government and industry navigated this precipitous economic decline that followed decolonization and the sort of collapse of port traffic in Marseille. I shouldn't say collapse, but reorientation is maybe a better word. And so, for instance, things like soap and oilseed processing, those industries fell apart, and other industries like petrochemicals and steel grew pretty quickly, actually. And so one of these chapters is going to be specifically about petrochemicals and the rise of plastic. And the reason for that is that the factory that got sued was supplying raw materials to a factory that was manufacturing one of the first forms of plastic that the French began producing in the early 1950s. And given that there are lots of graduate students in the audience, I should say that the history of plastic is woefully and really surprisingly untouched. And there's lots of room there, I think, for people to do interesting work. I'm also going to have a chapter on immigration. And so over half of the workers who were employed at the ricin factory were foreign. And that's a disproportionately very large number when compared to the number of foreign workers in general who were in Marseille and in France at large. Many workers, of course, who were migrant were forced to do dirty, dangerous jobs. And the ricin factory is no exception to that rule. I've been reading a lot of medical journals written by doctors who specialized in immigrant medicine. One case study I'm looking at involves lead poisoning at various sites across the city that again disproportionately affected migrant workers since they had higher employment rates in these sectors. Yes, I'm also going to have a chapter on, and I think I've completely lost track of my slides. Oh yes, here's the Corbusier's building, looking very colorful. And right, thinking about pollution. So after thinking about plastics and the growth of these new industries, the decline of other industries, the importance of immigrant labor to this economic development, I want to step back and think more about the bigger forms of industrial pollution that plagued the city, and so specifically air pollution and water pollution. And one of the interesting stories with the air pollution is that it demonstrates some early efforts at greenwashing. And so in 1958, an association was formed that was devoted to the prevention of atmospheric pollution. And what's interesting about the society is that although the president of the association was always the mayor of the city, the vice president was always a really important person in the industrial world. And so for about a decade, the vice president of the association committed to the prevention of air pollution was the regional coordinator for Shell Oil, which is kind of extraordinary. If I made it up, you wouldn't believe me, right? And so as a result, air pollution and water pollution become technical issues, and industry has to comply with certain threshold limits. And as long as they do, they're free to pollute as much as they would like, which is, of course, a situation that we're still dealing with in 2023. And the last theme that I want to think about with the book is the spatial politics of environmental degradation. And here, I'll be drawing more specifically on the field of political ecology, although that's sort of riddled throughout the project. But just thinking about the forms of power that are involved in the way the city gets developed in the post-war period. And the best way that I could illustrate this usually is to show these contrasting images of two different beaches in Marseille. And so the beach that is directly in front of a petrochemicals refining operation is located on the north side of the city, which is poorer, tends to be inhabited by immigrant minorities, whether they're first generation, second generation. And then the beach in the bottom left is located on the south side of the city, which received much more support from the municipal government in terms of building parks and green spaces. This is where the affluent residents of Marseille tend to reside. And I don't know if I just went so fast because I was worried that 5 minutes was a tiny amount of time. But that's the book in a nutshell. Thank you, everybody.
Our third presenter, do you need to switch? Okay, is Sarandha Jain. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto studying the multinodal network of petroleum manufacturing, circulation, and use in India. I'm looking at you as if I'm not sure about that, but examining petroleum as an infrastructure for the Indian state and society. To understand the politics of petroleum in the everyday, she studies the modes of government, forms of sociality, and constellations of power that petroleum produces and is produced by both its manufacturing and its use. So, I think you speak, and then I'll come up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible to the Zoom audiences? Yes, okay. So I'll present just a small part of my project today in the interest of time, but here's the broad arc of the full project. I investigate how oil becomes government, but also escapes government in India. I do this by tracking oil from its production to its consumption, based on ethnography in oil refineries and research institutes, and also in a working class neighborhood with black marketeers and ordinary consumers. My fine-grained account of how refining operates in India shows how political possibilities get programmed into petroleum products. Because the Indian state manufactures oil as a means to distribute itself into citizens' lives in the form of petroleum products that shape people's everyday lives and relations with the state. Most oil companies are state-owned in India. Now, while I chart this link between fuel and state power, I also argue that neither the government nor engineers entirely control this system. First, they're inhibited by the material properties of oil, and then by black marketeers and consumers who buy and use them in unauthorized ways, and by state actors who facilitate this. So central to this project has been the examination of oil's disparate worlds of production and consumption in conjunction for understanding that oil is not tied only to state power and big capital, but is also imposed upon by caste and gender. Power is constituted differently at different points in the supply chain, and oil's relationship with power is not singular or monotonous. This is vital to understand, I argue, how an energy regime is made and unmade, how it can be reformed, the layers, ways, and places in which it inserts itself socially, also getting reconfigured by sociocultural factors. Today, I flagged the idea that microprocesses of refineries fold politics into the petroleum products produced and argue that these products are inherently political inventions. Questioning the ontological givenness of oil and unpacking the systems that produce it together allow me to answer the question about the politics of petroleum. Describing the step-by-step process of oil refining, I demonstrate that petroleum products are invented and not natural, deriving their politics from an intricate combination of crude oil's materiality, the technical processes of refining, and the hidden human decisions shaping them. So I'm going to give you an example of the difference between kerosene, liquefied petroleum gas or LPG, and piped natural gas or PNG, which is methane, all used for cooking in India. As a liquid, kerosene can be divided and shared by consumers. It can be inhaled to alter states of consciousness or added to dilute expensive diesel with devastating environmental effects. Easily accessible and movable, its consumption is freed from state grids and is not surveilled. Its alternate uses and black market are a source of menace for the Indian government. This allows for the sustenance of informal society central to politics and sociality across urban India. Yet, it remains subsidized as mass protests have accompanied attempts to remove the subsidy. LPG, being gaseous, is not divisible by consumers, and its large cylinders are difficult to share, disabling neighborly sociality. It can be purchased only from government dealers and requires a biometric ID, a bank account, a phone number, and a fixed address. It demands an integration of users into networks of the state, brokering different relations with the state from those of kerosene. One involves mass protest on revoking the subsidy and solidarity via sharing. The other involves individual consumption and regulation. One has the state addressing a population through a mass subsidy. The other has the state addressing individuals through biometrics. One is a tool for people to hold the government accountable. The other turns oil provision into technical arrangements outside politics to consolidate governmental power. So kerosene is social and fugitive, while LPG is individualized and detectable. PNG, coming into private kitchens via pipes, takes individual consumption to a higher level, as LPG cylinders can still be moved between homes, but pipes coming directly to the kitchen cannot be shared at all. Its metered usage also alters the relations between consumers and providers. PNG and LPG create rationing subjects, whereas kerosene and other fuels do not subjectify citizens in such minute ways. Factors responsible for these social effects are both decisions regarding the materiality of these substances and decisions regarding their mode of distribution. These decisions are made within the international oil industry and in refineries. Everyday life in a refinery involves the constant interaction between different factors in petroleum production. The mechanical and administrative system interacts with the subjective experience and the daily life of an engineer, and the material autonomy of oil that is always throwing surprises at engineers, and with the external environment, which is climatic, geophysical, political, and social. How do these different components of petroleum production impinge on each other, and how are the variations in these factors managed? All of this involves human decisions. My project addresses these questions by paying close attention to the minutiae of everyday life in the sites of oil production. Deconstructing oil and the systems it is produced through is crucial to understand the myth of its naturalness, which affords immense power to its makers. Petroleum products do the bidding of their producers in the lives of their consumers, and this could look very different as they're not natural and can take on a different shape. Before I end, I'd like to flag one more related conceptual hook. It is fundamental to closely examine the tension between different actors in petroleum production, not just for knowing the politics of a product and the human decisions embedded in it, but also for locating environmental and ethical responsibility in systems with spread out agency. I do this by distinguishing between agency and accountability, and between what I term action-taking agency and decision-making agency. But I'll have to end here, so I could say more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Right. Next up, we have Martha Swift. She's a writer, researcher, and educator, and a Commonwealth Scholar at the University of Oxford, where she's a DPhil candidate in the Faculty of English. Martha researches world literature and the temporality of concepts of the world, quote unquote, the interaction of autofiction and cosmopolitics in transnational novels, and theories of waste. Over to you.
You hear me? My internet chose that exact moment to cut out.
Yes.
Perfectly.
Yep.
Oh, good. Great. Thank you. Great. I'm glad that it's come back in. So today I actually want to talk about a project that I'm working on adjacent to my PhD, globality. But it's a study of waste in the new wave in Chinese science fiction, which very broadly is kind of a contemporary dystopian turn in the genre. Kind of maybe people debate whether it's since 1990 or since 2000. So I'm interested specifically in how the presence of waste, like in all of these dystopias, is doing two simultaneous things. One, challenging a kind of 20th century imbrication of science fiction in China with this dream of limitless development. And also, like more importantly, probably for the issue of futurity, renegotiating the waste-human relationships that dominate waste theories and ecological imaginaries coming out of the global north. So as I've encountered them, these influential theories by people like Zygmunt Bauman or Don Scanlon or Susan Signay Morrison kind of continue to emphasize examples from affluent consumer societies and to build upon this premise of what Lucy Bell calls a physical and ideological distance from waste. So this is the idea that like expelling waste from spaces or the self or the nation is an affirmation of their modernity. And like a corollary like this is that very little attention is paid to lives kind of lived in or with or of waste, or to like the ultimate destinations of discards from the global north, including significantly places like China's southeast coast, which was until recently the destination of most of the world's e-waste, which is particularly hazardous. So one valence of looking at the intersection of waste and the new wave is in addressing this failure of waste studies to deal with the globality of waste systems, but also the kind of new visions of futurity that it's offering. So I look at three examples of the new wave, including Hao Jingfang's novella Folding Beijing, Chen Qifan's novel Waste Tide, and Han Song's short story Regenerated Bricks. And this selection works really well for talking about waste, but I think it's also important to say that they've all been translated into English, which is mostly how I'm reading them, but also really significant for their kind of entry into this world literary consciousness, which has all sorts of like ramifications for the ideas of cyclicality and exchange, which I won't talk about here, but we can in questions. So in contrast to this kind of dominant idea that these authors are making visible the discarded or distorted side effects of China's rapid modernization, and their dystopias are all visions of a future full of refuse and redundant workers and ecological catastrophe. But amongst this, and I think most importantly, they're featuring waste-human interactions that promote living amongst or with waste rather than against it as the basis for plausible futures. So most theories of human interactions with waste specifically are governed by terms of control and ordering. So I'm thinking specifically of codification and recycling. But the new wave and Han's story Regenerated Bricks specifically explores creative and more unpredictable encounters. So I want to propose, or one outcome that I'm thinking about from this research is the term regeneration as the marker of this kind of new futurity. So I'll just work through a progression of these terms to kind of give you an outline of what's happening. So codification is one of the most basic processes that defines waste in opposition to clean or civilized spaces. It's kind of like the precondition for an expulsion. But spaces that rely on waste for definition in this negative way are therefore always susceptible to it. So, I mean, one example, and we don't have time for close reading, but it's the trans-urban movement of this waste worker, Lao Dao, who's the protagonist in Folding Beijing. He moves across this like heavily codified city that literally folds to accommodate different socioeconomic activities. And his movement is like a representation of the inefficacy of order building impulses. But then we have recycling, which is kind of a way of describing the sanctioned return of wasted things, since it's inevitable. How can we make it work for us, quote unquote? So the sanctioned return of wasted things to codified spaces, specifically by recommodifying them. But in this, it's another expression of human dominance over waste that we insist on distancing. So waste tide is looking more specifically about how waste itself can resist this kind of endless subordination. So Mimi is a main character. She's an indentured waste worker, and she is infected with a genetically engineered virus from this discarded prosthetic. So it's very science fiction. But as a result of this, she kind of transforms into this waste human cyborg with a kind of digital consciousness that enables her to escape these cycles of commodification. And also claim at the end, like, I'm only the beginning. So is this intimation of new futures, but also specifically about the adaptability of waste and its ability to cross borders of the human. So already we have this idea of creative interactions, but it's in Han's regenerated bricks that regeneration, like it's in the title, becomes the term for this capacity for a transgressive return. And also a creative existence beyond recommodifying confines, like of recycling or commodification. So most importantly, regeneration is led by rather than imposed upon waste. And actually the story was inspired by this real invention called the rebirth bricks, which were designed after the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008, which I didn't know about before doing this. It's cool to find out. So the story is describing this world in which, like in these real bricks, the world itself is like rebuilt from the ruins of buildings, but in the story, the bricks also have the remains of human bodies and kind of the remnants of their minds in them. So all of this becomes building material, and everything becomes kind of conscious or sentient. So in this way, he's proposing this possible future reconstructed from its own ruins, which is crucially reliant on the existence of waste and this contact between waste and the remains of the human, rather than this illusion that to progress into the future is about like constantly refining or getting rid of waste and pushing into this like very sanitized idea of civilization. So regeneration is kind of like the key term that I'm thinking about for this kind of new kind of futurity. And I think science fiction, obviously it's dealing with possible futures, but one of the things that the new wave is doing in its dystopian kind of turn is dealing with the possibility of future at all. So it's quite significant that there's this genre, which has historically been obsessed with like a technological optimism and this kind of techno-utopian idea of development with no end, is now like reorienting that concern towards a mode of progress, although I'm not necessarily sure that's the right word, that does away with that sense of expulsion in favor with a creative and collaborative proximity. Those two words are key: creative and collaborative proximity to waste. So there's something also to be said about the texts entering circulation via translation, kind of in imitation of, or reverse imitation of, the waste that they feature passing from Anglophone spaces into China. So which is prompting a recalibration of, I would like it to prompt a recalibration of waste relations the world over. And there's a lot more to be said about the history of science fiction in China as well, and also the significance of these texts being in English, but we can discuss that in questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Jane Robbins Mize, you can correct me if that's pronounced incorrectly. My name is always pronounced incorrectly. Is visiting assistant professor of literature and creative writing at Hamilton College and received her PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania. Her current book is a project called Waterworks: Settler Industrialization and North American Literature. And this project examines case studies in the Mojave Desert, Florida Everglades, and elsewhere to reveal how writers theorized human-water relations at sites of large-scale industrial transformation. Please.
Thank you so much. It is Mize, but that is totally fine. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Thanks so much for these really interesting talks. My research, yes, focuses on the colonization and industrialization of North America and on human relations to the environment. And before coming to Hamilton, I was a fellow for 2 years with the Penn Program for Environmental Humanities. And through PPEH, I became involved in a working group of incarcerated and non-incarcerated writers, artists, and scholars who are thinking at the intersection of environmental justice and carceral studies. Our group is called Products of Our Environment, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes sharing a bit about our work with you. First, I'll talk about how we understand prisons as crucial sites for environmental justice struggles, and then I'll share an example of our collaboration that we hope contributes to the imagination of just futures. So Products of Our Environment was originally created by friends Jared Bozadaj, and who's an incarcerated writer at Fishkill Correctional Facility in upstate New York, and Isabel Lane, who is currently an instructor at Harvard. We're members of a broader international working group for community-based researchers. It's called Intersecting Energy Cultures, and it's led by Rebecca Macklin and Bethany Wiggin, and I'd be happy to talk more about that group in the Q&A. The mission statement of Products of Our Environment, which was co-written by Jared and Isabel, includes 4 priorities. Those are supporting intersectionality across gender, sexuality, and race, sharing stories about the environment and our place within it, thinking ecologically and expansively about social justice, and rethinking the boundaries between inside, outside, and incarcerated free. As many of you might know, as recently as 2020, the EPA here in the States did not recognize incarcerated people as stakeholders in environmental justice efforts. We in Products of Our Environment believe that environmental justice cannot be achieved without the acknowledgement and active participation of incarcerated people who are some of the most vulnerable to environmental hazards and to the negative effect of climate change. Many of us also identify as abolitionists, meaning that we don't believe that the solution to environmental justice for incarcerated people lies in creating greener prisons, but rather lies in eradicating prisons from our understanding of justice writ large. So it's important to note here that the entanglements of the environmental crisis and the carceral state actually begin in our neighborhoods and then continue in our prisons. Black, Indigenous, POC, and low-income communities are disproportionately polluted, policed, and incarcerated. The Huffington Post has reported that, quote, Black Americans are 1.5 times more likely than whites to breathe air polluted by burning fossil fuels, 3 times more likely to die from the lung and heart diseases that such pollutants cause, and also 6 times more likely to be killed by the police. And the NAACP has reported that, quote, race, even more than class, is the #1 indicator for the placement of toxic facilities in this country, in the US, end quote. So likewise, just as toxic facilities are built in neighborhoods where mostly people of color live, toxic facilities and prisons are also constructed near one another here in America, which leads to really high health risks and high risks of environmental disaster for incarcerated people. So through Products of Our Environment, we ask ourselves, how can writing, art, and interdisciplinary research contribute to the creation of what the abolitionist scholar and activist Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls life-affirming institutions that are committed to just futures? So one way we accomplish this is, or try to answer this question, I guess, is by meeting regularly as a small group and as a large group, and we patch in incarcerated members by phone as much as possible. We have sent mailings to people inside who can't meet with us on the outside. Here's an example of a few of those. We also actively exchange writing and drawing with people on the inside. So here's just some examples of some of the responses we've gotten. And our meetings and conversations have led to two kind of more major projects outside of these exchanges. One is an open access syllabus on environmental justice, abolition, and the arts, coming soon. And the second is a graphic novella titled Evacuation Plan. Here's a little teaser of that. Evacuation Plan was conceived of by Jared and Isabel, who I mentioned, myself, and our collaborator at UCSB, David Pello. And it's been illustrated by the incarcerated artist, Adam Roberts, with support from C.M. Campbell. We were meeting and we were talking about the need for prisons to have evacuation plans in the case of environmental crisis. And we started wondering why incarcerated people don't learn about evacuation plans, even if the prison does have one. We realized, of course, that evacuating the prison is antithetical to the prison's goals of keeping people in place. And so we started thinking about the resonances between evacuation and decarceration. So, one thing led to another, and now we have a fully illustrated graphic novella exploring these ideas and articulating some of our research. And our plan is to make it freely available to people inside and outside of prison. And our hope is that the project can demonstrate that meaningful collaboration can happen across the prison wall, and that it's in fact crucial to do so in order to achieve environmental justice, especially outside of the bounds of institutionally recognized encounters between free and incarcerated people. So working outside of college and prison programs, working outside of like the official channels of meeting with people inside. Our kind of broader goal for this novella is to share our belief that the only way to achieve an environmentally just future is, of course, to deconstruct the prison wall in our shared work and in our lived realities. So I'll just close by noting that this publicly engaged work with products of our environment is, of course, inspiring and informing my own research in the environmental humanities. And I'm currently working on a project that explores the intersection of environmentalism and the carceral state in the 20th century. So looking at how we've gotten here to this concept of greening prisons today. So I'd really be excited to talk about both projects in the Q&A. Thanks so much.
All right, we're going to close with a presentation by Bethany Wiggin, who's a professor of German and the founding director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania. Her books and essays explore histories of migration, language, multilingualism, and cultural translation since the Columbian Exchange across the Atlantic world. And her work has appeared in journals ranging from PMLA to the journal Nature.
Thank you so much. It's such a treat to be with you. I'm standing between our discussion and I'm going to try and keep this really brief after these really wonderful 5 presentations that we've already heard. So hello from Philadelphia, the traditional homelands of the Lenape people. And many thanks also to the colleagues at Toronto and in Mississauga for organizing this Spotlight series. In these brief minutes that I have with you, I'm going to talk to you about my climate story, and especially this project's philosophy and goals. And at the very end, I'll share a brief invitation in case any here might like to get involved. So as you heard, I direct the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, and in this program, we aim to catalyze connections across disciplines, across environmental ways of knowing, and across sectors. We seek to connect academic researchers with community-based researchers so that we might together design and carry out public-facing experiments in support of environmental and climate justice. And I think Jane Robbins and Isabel and collaborators project is just a fantastic example of that. However, I think this understanding of environmental humanities is maybe a little bit unusual, and I think that might be something that we could talk about in the Q&A. This understanding it foregrounds environmental humanities as an evolving provocation or a contact zone, an emergent field, a place in flux where participants come together across disciplines and even across sectors to explore how different knowledge systems represent and address past and present environments, ecologies, places, and worlds. I understand environmental humanities as an evolving set of practices rather than a received set of disciplinary objects and conventions, and thus my own work is often project or place-based, and it is characterized by change and transformation rather than by stable states and received disciplinary borders. I seek out expertise often located beyond academic communities. This focus on place is one you'll see in this My Climate Story project, and it is part of a commitment to work with local and Indigenous stewards to learn from and with lived experiences. Currently, excuse me, the program is working on 3 multi-year public engagement projects. You heard Jane Robbins mention intersecting energy cultures. And we're also working on ecotopian toolmaking for the Anthropocene, a project now in partnership and in residence at the Morris Arboretum and Gardens here in Philadelphia, as well as My Climate Story. My Climate Story is a public research project to document and share personal local experiences of global climate change. It includes a freely available curriculum, a series of participatory workshops, a short documentary, a growing set of teacher and student resources, and a story bank where hundreds of storytellers have shared their personal narratives of climate change that get tagged with light metadata to make them searchable by location, by climate impact, and the author's feelings. Most contributors have shared that they are worried, sad, and anxious, and they also tell us that sharing their story helps them to feel less alone and empowered to take climate action. So obviously you've heard of climate data and climate models, but what you might be wondering is a climate story, and what do climate stories do? As we tell project participants in workshops, climate stories can illuminate and explore the impact of changing climates on people's everyday lives. Climate stories make climate data meaningful and actionable. A climate story, in 3 sort of points, a climate story shares an individual experience sensing climate change. It is anchored to a specific, personally meaningful place, and it invites the storyteller to include more than just climate data, but also emotions, reflections, and memories. So why does the project insist participants also talk about climate change? Conversations are building blocks of culture. They are cultural tools, and they illuminate the ties between the personal and the political, or between private life and political economy, or even political ecology. When we consider climate conversations as cultural tools, and when we consider our failure to create and use those tools widely enough, we begin to understand climate denial quite differently from the way it's more often understood here in the US as something that's perpetrated by big oil, although it is also that. But exploring these everyday strategies of denial, of not talking about climate in polite society, for example, helps us understand climate denial as socially organized rather than merely as an individual phenomenon. Climate stories, or their lack, help us understand how holding climate information at a distance is one strategy by which, and I'm quoting Kari Norgaard now, by which a non-response to climate change can be produced through the cultural practices of everyday life. Studying climate stories helps us understand our obstinance to changing in the face of the changing climate as social drama. Climate inaction emerges not so much as a result of an information deficit, that is, if only we had more science, or if only people listening to this science would act on climate, then we would have meaningful action. But instead, if we are to tackle the psychic numbing that climate change can provoke, we need to offer conversational tools. I'd invite you to check out some of the essays and the resources. There we teach people to put climate on the table, even at the upcoming American holiday of Thanksgiving. Or you could browse the story bank that you see here on the right side of this slide, where you'll also find a number of Canadian climate stories contributed last winter by students in a class with Toronto's Sherry Lee. The project started in a class I taught for Philadelphia high school teachers, and then over several years of working with amazing Penn students, we developed tools to recognize our individual climate stories and to build platforms to document and share them. Last year, we supported 9 high school classrooms across our city to create curricular resources, and we offered workshops in partnership with News Radio WHYY, a PBS syndicate. And now we're designing workshops to train climate story workshop facilitators, and you can learn more about that here. These are paid internships for undergraduates that we're taking on applications for. So that's it about my climate story, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, I guess we'll get started, and I see that Venus has a question. No. Okay. Anybody? First, I invite anybody here who has a question, and then maybe I'll go to the chat. Anybody who is online, feel free to speak your question. You can also put it in the chat. Sherry, please, Sherry.
Should I, am I audible to the mic,
Well,
everyone?
you could be. We could also give you the, just, do you know how to turn it on?
Great, Sherry.
Hello, is this
No,
on?
no, it's not on.
It's not on.
Here. Is it green?
Now it's green. Is it on now?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for responding to this very open invitation to join a conversation about futurity. This is just a really open thing, obviously, to get things started, but I was really interested in Joseph sort of framing things in relation to very large scale notions of commons and large scale and long-standing historical processes like democracy. And then thinking about all of the examples that you're offering, from Venus talking about the protest in Marseille to Martha talking about these waste users, and through each presentation of the way in which these responses are focused in relations of smaller groups of people or communities. And I'm just interested, honestly, in people's thoughts or responses to the idea of what we understand to be a global problem. And Martha, the way your work sort of frames concepts of the world is obviously pertinent here, but I think all of these things, when in fact, a lot of the times I think we're then instead looking towards very local sites of community collaboration, conversation that are, the relationship between sort of the scale of these issues, the scale of the global, how big is a commons? Maybe that's partly what I'm asking, but anyway, this is just like a really open thing to let anyone respond.
I mean, I can start if everyone can hear me okay. Yeah. I mean, my main thing that I do is world literature, and this idea of not so much commons, but like scale, and the relationship between local and global is obviously really important to any question of world. But I also, and obviously also to the idea of environment. And I would say that you can't really divorce those two things, even though a lot of theorists of world literature do try to. But one thing that I think my work on waste is kind of revealing or suggesting is that although action and solution often seem to be really local, like waste as a phenomenon, but also as kind of this ontological idea of agency and changeability, is like constantly a reminder that local activities do have like globalness embedded in them. And it's not always that like there's like a global ramification or some catastrophe will be caused, but it's more that like an object of waste is like already inscribed with travel across the world, and also has the potential to travel as well. And like the same, I guess, is true for there's a lot of slide between like waste and waste workers or wasted people. And that also has a lot of implications for different kinds of migration, sanctioned or otherwise, and the kind of global access that's allowed once your status is sort of considered to be external to productive life. Not an answer about commons, but that's the way I'm thinking about the interaction between local and global.
And just speak. No muting. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's again speaking on behalf of the ancient Greeks. This is a problem that that the Greek philosophers wondered about. It was thought that a functional collective governance was not possible beyond a certain number of people. And so Athens had grown too large to be manageably governed democratically, for example, in Plato's view. That's one thing that comes to mind. I mean, another thing one can think about is the way that, well, speaking of, let's say, outsourcing waste or the things that are not seen that make possible the functioning of the very thing that we want, which is a kind of perhaps democratic politics, if I may say so. In Athens, of course, democracy emerged alongside a certain practice of slavery. And so, yeah, I think just kind of adding on to Sherry's sort of question, yes, there's an unseen side as well. I'm sorry, that didn't quite go where I was thinking it was going, but I'll end there.
Oh, there's a question. There's several questions, it looks like. Do you want me to go up there?
Bethany has a comment there.
Oh, okay.
I'll just respond quickly.
Go ahead.
To Sherry's provocation, which I think is super useful to also get us to think about maybe a little bit explicitly the connections between when we talk about the commons, whether it's Plato's, you're thinking with Plato or Gerhard Harden, or more recently maybe Simona Muller's toxic commons. But I think it also gets us to think about public, right? Not just public goods, but the constitution of public participants and public educational groups as well. And one really kind of sort of tricky issue to think about, I think, especially when we talk about public environmental humanities, is of course who we mean by that public, who's included in that and who isn't. Every country has its own, idiosyncratic and particular historically generated educational systems. Here in where we are, I'm been teaching now for 20 years at a very private institution that nonetheless receives a lot of public subsidies and doesn't pay taxes to this. And partially for that reason, I wanted to make a set of projects that would kind of quite literally take university resources and try to transfer them to city populations who aren't often beneficiaries of this very private institution. But also partly to be thinking about how is public education around climate literacy being configured. U.S. education in the States on the primary and secondary levels are controlled by, first of all, local levels of governance by cities and townships, and the tax dollars that are collected there. So in the city of Philadelphia, the city finances predominantly its school system. It's the so-called largest poor city in the United States, which means that the school system is commensurately funded underfunded. But the standards of education are actually promulgated at the state level. So the state of Pennsylvania kind of mandates what public schools across the Commonwealth are teaching. And just to let you know, the state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has recently received a grade of F in climate education. So that was another kind of impetus for making this project.
Maybe this is a good follow-on from that. Sibo Chen, who is a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, really his question is, in your view, so any of you, what are the key barriers we need to address to facilitate alternate ways that energy is discussed today? The question is about effective communication to publics. I know there was a number of people that talked about that, Bethany, perhaps most explicitly, but that was also there in Jane. Maybe, yeah, I was going to say something on top of Sibo's question, but let's just leave it at that. It's a big question, and maybe he's not asking about what works, but what are the impediments? Venus.
Yeah, I mean, I might answer that question and the one from Elliot Fuller at the same time, and that I don't think it has anything to do with what's conveyed to the public in terms of messaging or information, right? I think, who was it? Somebody today talked about how there's an abundance of information available to people, and that doesn't seem to be the difference between acting and not acting, right? The difference between acting and not acting is the existence of very politically influential stakeholders who are still making a lot of money off the existing energy regime. And so, and of course, they know, right? I mean, they've known longer than the general public about the environmental damage that their companies have been, have been promoting, right? So yeah, I took a very pessimistic answer, but I don't think the issue is about communicating to the public. And then, yeah, just quickly to Elliot. I don't know that I would single out ports as being especially important in terms of pollution and global capital. Well, I don't know. I'd have to think about that some more, actually. It might be a question for Lala Khalili, who's thought a bit more explicitly about ports and infrastructure. The reason I was interested in Marseille as a port was that originally the project was supposed to be just about migrant labor. And in that way, ports are, of course, very important, since Marseille is the first arrival for many immigrants who are coming from the Mediterranean basin. But as I said, the source material just didn't really pan out. And so I had to pivot and blow the project up into something larger. In terms of plastics, I'm not sure the port specifically is playing an important role here. Plastics manufacturing in France in the 20th century is actually happening mostly inland. What's happening in Marseille is the creation of some sort of very base materials that are used in plastics fabrication that are synthesized from petrochemicals. And so those arrive in the port, they're synthesized in Marseille, and then those are transported to these inland areas where things like nylon or PVC are being manufactured. Yeah, I'll stop and hand it over to somebody else.
Please, Jane.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think I could answer it slightly differently or within a different framework, which is to say that I think part of the challenge of communicating knowledge generated by the energy humanities or by the environmental humanities more broadly is that academic institutions don't necessarily value public communication when they are adjudicating their faculty's work. So I think one barrier to communication that I've faced is just that work has to happen on the side, kind of outside of the expectations of my institution and my job description. So I think as members of institutions, if I think one way that we can work towards more effective communication to the public and is to challenge our administrators to rethink how they value our work and or at least create incentives for doing that and for actually collaborating meaningfully with people outside of the ivory tower. Yeah, so that's just, it's a kind of different way of answering it, but something I've been thinking about.
Bethany, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Jane Robbins just used some of the words that I would just reiterate, which is, I think, collaboration. And I had raised my hand in part because I wanted to respond a little bit to what Venus was saying. It was, in fact, me who said the information deficit model is really not working. We know that, right? Like more science, like more information is actually not helping, right? But meaning co-creation or co-constitution of subjects of inquiry, I think, is actually very helpful. One of the ways we see that is through working with inhabitants who live in energy kind of justice environments to ask, what do you want to see from an energy transition, and actually helping marginalized communities to have a larger voice. I think academics can be very useful in that regard, both as in terms of ethnographic work that we do, but also quite literally as being amplified, like kind of megaphones and amplifying marginalized voices. So collaboration, as Jane Robbins said, I think is kind of the name of the game.
Okay, maybe I'll ask a question. I don't know can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So I'd ask all of you to reflect on the title of today's session, which is about sustainability and futurity. So when I first saw the title of this session or the theme of this session, I had to reflect many things. I reflect on many things. First of all, my first reaction would be that these two terms are in opposition. That any evocation of sustainable it's already a discourse that is tainted, that it already contains within itself a certain kind of politics, that if it is compelled to some kind of futurity, it's one that is very much similar to status quo practices and procedures. But then I started to think a little bit more about that, and I wondered about the futurity part. So sustainability in relation, if I'm describing a certain kind of compromised sustainability in relationship to futurity, it's actually keeping open the future is an open horizon, maybe not the one we would want, but as a certain kind of open horizon that we might want a different kind of open horizon. Just wanted to reflect, tell me about how you see these things going together. I find it interesting to think about their relation. I'm not sure what, I have no conclusions about what it means to put these two things together and to think about them in relationship to the various humanities practices and research that this group of people can do. Okay.
Can you maybe rephrase that? Slightly more concise.
Well, can you say, did you have something to say? Do you want me to say again?
Well, sorry, I think, so is the question about the relationship between sustainability and futurity? How are these terms related?
Yes, how are these put together? Why are these part of what you're doing?
Yes, okay, I see.
Is it fair to say, Imre, that you're asking about that kind of version of sustainability that we're familiar with that is often associated with neoliberalism, and it's a particular version of sustainability that has possibly been co-opted?
I would want to know what we want from that idea of sustainable, okay. I suppose. Okay. Because I would love to hear more and talk more about in these very brief presentations, there's a certain idea of communication, of what a public is that one tries to communicate to, and also those that are impeding the possibility of making any change in the way one might hope, ecologically or environmentally. And I suppose one thing I could say there is that in my current role, I spend lots of time with bureaucrats, with people in government, with people in business who spend all of their time interested in sustainability, that do it in a non-cynically, that put incredible amounts of resources towards it, that have think tanks that are being developed by some banks, for instance, all happening this year, all happening with the last 3 years. They're into sustainability. They wanted to make it keep going. They're interested in learning. Okay, I was just part of a program which was about working on sustainability for minorities, for equity, deserving equity, seeking groups and young people in Scarborough, which is in the east part of Toronto. These companies wanted to work to make sure that happens. Okay, so how I guess those of us that are also trying to do a more left-wing critical production of a different kind of sustainable, I suppose, a different kind of future from that sustainability. What do we do when the sustainable no longer becomes something to go against, but it becomes the given? It becomes the given, and simply kind of saying like, well, it's, you know, it's a givenness that is a problem, isn't quite enough anymore. What does communication mean? Who are we communicating to? I suppose it's this kind of opening that I'd be very curious to hear about. I don't have any, I'm just speaking about the situation that I'm part of.
I can jump in, just because I think that abolitionist thinking actually gives us a really useful way of engaging with your question. Abolitionists are, of course, working toward something that feels really impossible in the moment, the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. And so they often talk about the difference between reform and non-reformist reform. So reforms that are invested in the status quo, reforms that are more akin to what you're describing as the kind of milquetoast sustainability discourse of the present, whereas a non-reformist reform is a reform that is enacted in pursuit of an abolitionist horizon, which is something that we know might not happen in our lifetimes or even in 2 generations from now, but is something that is always, you know, not even the periphery, at the end of the road. So I think there's a kind of, maybe we could apply that kind of thinking to the sustainability, futurity binary that you're thinking about. You know, are there moves toward just futures, towards an idealized version of environmental justice that the sustainability folks might be interested in, and if so, those are the ones to move towards rather than the ones that maintain the status quo. So yes, so a way that abolitionist thinking might be helpful here.
Right, fascinating. Bethany.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think on some level, you know, as I think it's Kate Madalena in the chat pointed out, you know, futurity is a tainted term, much like sustainability. And yet at the same time, on the days when I really try to think beyond cynicism, I think that both of these concepts can be configured in such a way so that they are understood to offer kind of rich repositories of past and maybe future archives, tools for thinking that help us beyond this sort of feeling of stuckness, that we're stuck in this sort of neoliberal present that we just can't seem to get beyond. Sustainability, of course, pointing toward the past and toward traditional environmental knowledge and other modes of being, other ways of being, perhaps maybe long ago, or maybe just not so long ago, but not part of the mainstream. And futurity, of course, as something open-ended. And futurity, you know, certainly doesn't have some automatic sign of virtue. You know, queer theorist Lee Edelman and others have certainly made us attuned to sort of reproductive logics, the sort of heteronormative reproductive logics of futurity, I think, for a long time now. But I do think, you know, there are ways to maybe think through these concepts in ways that can be actually quite emancipatory and holding open other possible paths and futures.
Thank you. Other questions, comments?
I was just going to add to this.
Yeah, please.
And your question, it made me think of the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss. Sorry to make things theoretical again, just my tendency. And his definition of deep ecology against what he calls shallow ecology, which is shallow ecology is a sustainability of the status quo, of the first world status quo, and contrasts a deep ecology against this. And there, I think he's affecting the logic that I was trying to bring out when I was talking about tragedy and the democratic endpoint of tragedy. Tragedy explodes the ideology of that the status quo is necessary. It shows us necessity, but it also shows a break with necessity and a new opening. I guess the question is, do we have to experience the tragedy before we can experience the democracy? Or can democracy find an opening within the tragic necessity that we're currently living under?
Thanks. Somebody else had their hand up. Venus.
It was me. I don't know that I was going to say much more than what Joseph said in another way, I guess. And that's just to, think about how the word sustainable is really about being able to continue whatever it is that you're doing into the future. And so I guess, the question that I would rather ask is what we're doing something that we'll be able to do in the future, but rather, are we doing the right thing in the present, right? And so I feel like a lot of the time we're trying to find mechanisms for making things sustainable that we probably shouldn't be doing anyways. And so I'd rather reframe the conversation and like make it more normative. I don't know that I've ever said that before in my life. But in this particular context, I feel like that might be more important. So rather than, I'm thinking about my own engagement with my institution and conversations about sustainability, right? Wanting to be able to continue, housing people in situations that are probably, more than what is needed, right? In order to compete with other institutions that are offering really nice housing to students, right? I think that's something that a lot of universities do, right? Spend egregious amounts of money on square footage for students so that their students, will want to come there. Rather than asking a different question, maybe about, habits of living, for instance. And now I'm beginning to ramble, so I should just mute myself and save everybody.
Okay. Okay. I'll read this. Can you see this, or should I read this out? I'll read it out. Thank you to all the organizers, speakers, and participants for an engaging discussion. This conversation has been particularly exciting. I'm thinking about Professor Swift's insights into the global-local interconnection and Professor Bivar's statement regarding decision-making power at the local level, I believe rooted in political ecology. Considering our dialogue, I wanted to ask our panelists, can we identify what discourses around sustainability and futurity need to come into a global lexicon that will lead to a world where local communities are empowered to actually have actionable decision-making power? Yet as I write this, I realize that the answer may already be unfolding in our ongoing conversation. Thanks again. I'll ask one other thing there, if it's okay. we've been talking here about a lexicon. We've been talking here about an assertion of normative ways of seeing what the present is and what the future should be. There's a shell in there in the normative. What would such a lexicon, where would it bite into existing forms of power that would enable local communities to do this? Where does it bite into infrastructure? Where does it bite into what Sarandha was talking about, which is a kind of the fact that technologies that we have adopted bring with them a politics, and they also kind of get stuck. We are having to deal with those politics that come with various technologies, whether we want to or not. There's a kind of a tech fix. This is a hard question, but I'm curious. What do we do? How do we make those kinds of politics manifest? I mean, Bethany was talking about this, or I think Bethany, you were talking about this in your presentation, that is about practice, that's important to you, that working with different communities is one way to make that kind of lexicon actionable, but I'm curious what others might say. And I hope I haven't stepped on the question that was just put out there. Maybe everybody can answer this impossibly difficult question. You each get half an hour.
If it's okay, I'll just start because I have to apologize that I have to leave. I do have another meeting that is starting up. The question is, I think, such a good one. And Imre, your own thinking on it has, I think, probably been, really helpful and extraordinary for many people in this room, and certainly for me. I don't know that there's any one answer, just like there's not any one public. I think, there are many ways of thinking about how to make things bite, to use your word. Biting is kind of an aggressive kind of action, and sometimes those are really needed. But I think there are also, there's a need for creating maybe more gentle spaces or gentle ways of welcome as well. And those can be equally inviting, whether they're through sharing resources of understanding about mutual benefits. I think there's a lot of ways to partner with various organizations at a variety of scales. And I'll just say one last thing, which is that one of the ways that we have tried to think about making local projects impactful is also through these questions of how to scale them, right? So we, on the one hand, in Philadelphia, we make a lot of really hyper local projects, but then in projects like intersecting energy cultures and with also my climate story, a lot of the methods, a lot of the practices that we pilot and develop in partnership with school communities or environmental justice communities here, we invite other researchers to take them and use them and refine them, make them better, or throw them out if they don't work in other contexts, and then to share back learnings about how are these campus community partnerships in a variety of places actually, working. I wish I could stay longer. I'm very sorry I have to leave. Thank you, guys. It's been so great to learn about your work. I've really, really appreciated it, and I'll look forward to watching the rest of the recording.
I think there's others that have to leave now as well. So perhaps let's bring an end to it. We can always continue these conversations later, perhaps in person, also online. So I want join me in thanking everybody that presented their work today. It's fascinating. I have lots of notes. There's lots of things I'd like to ask each of you, but I won't do that right now. Venus, please.
Those were claps. That's not a hand.
I'm so far away. All right. Yes, thanks very much. Clapping.